There is a particular kind of morning light that exists only in the Cumberland Plateau of Tennessee. It arrives slowly the way a careful man enters a room he is not certain he is welcome in. It filters through the ridgeline, first catching the tops of the oaks and the hickories before it finds the valley floor, and when it finally reaches the low ground, it has warmed itself against the stone of the mountain and carries something ancient in it, something that smells of limestone and deep water, and time measured not in years, but in the slow dissolution of rock into river. On a morning in the spring of 1926, a woman knelt beside a pool of water at the base of a pale limestone bluff, and the light found her the way it finds everything in that valley, slowly and with a kind of patient inevitability. She was 61 years old. Her hands were in the soil the way they had been most mornings of her adult life, and the water before her was blue. Not the blue of sky or river or any familiar thing. It was the blue of something alive beneath the surface, deep and mineral, and lit from within the color of a secret the mountain had been keeping for longer than anyone in the valley had been alive to wonder about it. She cupped her hands and lifted the water to her lips and drank. Cold, clean, sweet with the particular sweetness that has no flower or fruit behind it, only stone, only the long mineral conversation between moving water and ancient rock, a flavor that lives at the very back of the mouth where words form before they are spoken. She set her hands back into the soil and she was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sound the spring made as it pushed up out of the crack in the limestone and filled the basin and spilled over the low edge in a thread of a creek that crossed her land and then disappeared into another seam in the ground, the way everything in Grassy Cove eventually disappeared into the ground, taken back by the limestone, the way the cove takes back everything it loans to the surface world. Then she smiled, the close-lipped smile of a woman who has been proved right about something for so long that the proving has lost its urgency, and what remains is only the quiet satisfaction of having known. They told me this water was poison, she thought. Every soul in this valley told me. I drank it anyway. I drank it the first afternoon I knelt here, with nothing to my name but a worn dollar bill and a tin can with a tomato seedling in it, and nowhere on this earth to sleep except the ground I had just bought for 75 cents. That was 1881. She had been 16 years old. She had been afraid of many things in that year, but the water had not been one of them, and the not being afraid of it had changed everything that followed, had bent the whole long arc of her life into a shape she could not have predicted, and would not have traded for any of the shapes the valley had tried to force her into. She stayed kneeling for another moment, her hands in the good dark soil that had once been thin and gray and nearly dead, the soil that 45 years of blue spring water had transformed into the deepest and most productive ground in 3 counties. Then she rose slowly with the careful deliberateness of a woman whose knees have earned their complaints, and she looked out over the garden that stretched away from the spring in every direction, and she allowed herself the thing she rarely allowed, which was a full and unguarded accounting of what she had built. It was something to see, but to understand what it meant, you would have to understand first what it had been, and before that who she had been when she came to it. And to understand that you would have to go back. Back past the garden and the spring and the courtroom and the years of fighting and the years of growing and the years of teaching others to grow. Back past the marriage and the children and the grief and the joy. Back to the beginning of the story, which begins not in a garden, but in a room that smelled of lye soap and boiled wool, in an institution that had a long name and a short purpose. The purpose was to warehouse children that nobody wanted. The Cumberland Home for the Indigent stood on a ridge above the town of Crossville like an afterthought carved in stone, and in a sense it was exactly that. It was the afterthought of a society that had decided it preferred not to see certain things directly and had solved the problem of not seeing by gathering those things together in one building on one ridge and funding the building just adequately enough that no one could accuse them of cruelty, while also not funding it well enough that the children inside might ever mistake their situation for comfort. Clara Mabin had come to that building when she was 9 years old. Her father had died the year before, crushed under a poplar that fell wrong on a slope that gave no warning. He had been a timberman, which was a profession that paid steadily right up until the moment it stopped paying entirely, and when the poplar fell, it stopped. Her mother had lasted 1 more year, which Clara understood even then was an act of will rather than a biological inevitability, because the fever that took her in the winter of her grief was the kind of fever that the mountain called the cost of winter, but that Clara even at 9 understood was really the cost of sorrow. There were no aunts, no grandmothers, No cousins twice removed who might take in a girl with nothing to offer but her own existence. There was only the Cumberland home and the woman at the gate who looked at Clara the way people look at a problem they have agreed to manage but not to solve. 7 years. 7 years of learning to be invisible enough to avoid punishment, invisible enough to avoid suspicion. 7 years of lye soap and boiled wool and floors scrubbed until the grain of the wood showed through of stockings with turned heels and eyes kept down and questions kept behind her teeth. 7 years of being useful so that no one could call her a burden out loud, which was the only form of security available to a girl in her position. But there was one woman. There is always one woman in the stories of people who survive the places that are designed to grind them down. There is always one person who looks at the child everyone else has decided to overlook and sees instead something worth the trouble of an afternoon's honest attention. Her name was Mrs. Dean, and she ran the kitchen garden at the Cumberland home, the way Clara would later learn that great generals run campaigns with a complete understanding of terrain, an intimate knowledge of her resources, and an absolute refusal to waste either. Mrs. Dean was old. She had been old, it seemed, for as long as anyone at the home could remember, the kind of old that is so thoroughly achieved that it stops being a condition and becomes simply a characteristic, like the color of her eyes or the particular way she held her trowel. Her hands were the color and texture of cured leather and could read a wilting leaf the way a doctor reads a fevered pulse. Her back was bent from 60 years of honest attention to the ground, and her eyes, when they turned toward you, had the quality of light through deep water, clear and illuminating and slightly unsettling in their accuracy. She took Clara on because Clara asked a question. It was the spring of Clara's second year at the home, and she had been assigned to carry water to the kitchen garden, which was not a task that required thought, and was therefore a task well suited to a girl whom the staff had decided did not need much in the way of intellectual engagement. Clara had carried the water. She had poured it where she was told to pour it. And then she had stood for a long moment looking at 2 rows of bean plants that were supposed to be identical, but were not, because the eastern row was nearly a handspan taller than the western row and a shade darker in the leaf. Why, she asked. She was not asking Mrs. Dean specifically. She was asking the garden or the morning or the general universe. The way children ask questions before they have learned to reserve their wondering for appropriate audiences. But Mrs. Dean heard her. And instead of telling the girl to mind her work and stop standing idle with the water pail, Mrs. Dean crouched down beside her slowly and with the careful management of joints that had their own opinions about crouching, and she looked at the 2 rows of beans for a long moment, and then she explained. The morning sun, she said, and the drainage slope. The eastern row caught the first light an hour earlier, and the drainage from the compost pile ran subtly toward the east, feeding the right side roots with a richer seepage. 2 things that looked the same were not the same because the ground beneath them was not the same, and the ground was not the same because of the way water moved through it and the way light touched it, and a careful gardener could learn to read all of it if she was willing to look closely enough and ask the right questions. Clara was willing. She spent the next 4 years following Mrs. Dean down every row in that kitchen garden, gathering an education that no institution in the state of Tennessee had designed for her, but that turned out to be the most consequential curriculum she would ever receive. She learned that soil is not dirt. She learned that the right word for what lives in good earth is civilization, an entire invisible civilization of creatures too small to see all of them laboring in the dark, to turn what is dead back into what can feed the living. She learned to bury kitchen scraps in autumn leaves and let them ripen together into the black and crumbling stuff that Mrs. Dean called, without irony, black gold. She learned to rotate the crops from bed to bed each season so the ground never grew tired of feeding the same mouths. And she learned the thing she carried longest. A plant and the earth it stands in are locked in a quiet and endless bargain, Mrs. Dean told her once, crouching over a tomato seedling with the morning light on her old bent back. A good gardener is simply the one who learns the terms of the bargain and honors them. She said other things that Clara memorized without quite understanding the way you memorize a song in a language you are still learning. She said that a tomato was the truest witness a garden could produce. Good soil grows an honest tomato. Bad soil grows a beautiful lie. She said that the only inheritance worth having is the kind that lives in your hands, because everything else can be taken from you by a judge or a drought or a man with a better lawyer. But what your hands know, what they have learned through years of patient practice, belongs to you in a way that no document can deed and no court can repossess. Clara did not fully understand any of this when she heard it. She understands all of it now, which is the way wisdom works. It arrives early, it waits, and it becomes clear precisely when you need it most. Mrs. Dean died in the winter of 1880, taken by a cough that settled into her chest in October and would not be coaxed out. They buried her in the pauper's plot behind the home, a strip of ground that received the bodies of people the world had decided were worth less than the cost of a proper marker. And Clara was the only one who wept at the grave, because she was the only one who understood what the world had just lost in the losing of that particular old woman. The new matron who took over the garden had no use for a girl who asked why, instead of simply doing. The administrator who reviewed the records that winter had no use for a girl who was nearly 17 and therefore nearly old enough to be her own responsibility. In March of 1881, 3 months shy of her birthday, they put Clara's belongings in a flour sack, which took less time than it sounds, because the belongings were few, and they walked her to the gate, and the woman at the gate told her she ought to thank the institution for the years of Christian charity it had invested in her upbringing. Clara did not thank them. She walked through the gate with the flour sack over one shoulder and Mrs. Dean's voice in her head and $1 folded soft as cloth in the pocket of her dress, and she did not look back because there was nothing behind her worth the turning of her head. The county assessor's office in Pikeville smelled of ink and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where ambition goes to file its documentation and is then asked to wait. Mr. Aldous sat behind a counter that had absorbed 40 years of his presence and had begun to take on something of his character, careful, slightly yellowed, resistant to change. He was a man of late middle age whose fingers were stained so deeply with ink that Clara doubted honest soap had ever reached the true color of his skin. He had the eyes of a person who has spent decades watching people come in wanting things they cannot have, and who has developed a practiced sympathy that stops well short of inconvenience. He looked at Clara the way men in positions of minor authority look at young women who appear to have no business being where they are. Not with malice, with something more wearing than malice, which is pity combined with the hope that the problem will simply resolve itself by moving along. She was 16 years old. Her dress ended 2 inches above where it ought to have ended because she had grown and the cotton had not, and her shoes had been resoled with a leather patch that was already beginning to separate at one corner, and she was carrying a flour sack that contained everything she owned in the world, which was not a great deal. She set the flour sack down because it was heavy, and she looked at Mr. Aldous, and she asked him what $1 could buy. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled a ledger toward him and ran one ink-stained finger down a column of figures with the practiced efficiency of a man who has performed this gesture 10,000 times and expects to perform it 10,000 more. The finger stopped. He read the entry to himself first, which was itself a kind of communication. The brief hesitation of a man deciding how to frame something he already knows will not be received well. There was a lot, he said. Out at the eastern edge of Grassy Cove. 2 acres assessed at 75 cents, untouched by any buyer in 3 full years. Then he paused. He set the ledger down before he said the rest of it, and Clara noticed that he set it down the way people set things down when they are about to say something they would prefer not to have associated with official documentation. That was the Blue Spring lot, he said. His voice dropped the way a man's voice drops when he is speaking of something that makes him genuinely uneasy. Something that belongs to the category of things the rational mind knows are not supernatural, but the older, deeper mind is not entirely certain about. The water there ran blue, he said. Blue like nothing natural ought to be. Blue that the old-timers said meant copper or sulfur or some poison the Lord had buried in the rock, and the mountain had been foolish enough to bring back up to the light. Nothing grew near it. Every family that had ever tried to work that ground had given up inside a season. The cattle a previous owner had attempted to run there would stand at the far fence and bawl without stopping until the man gave up and drove them somewhere else. 3 families had held the deed in the past 30 years, and not one of them had ever believed in the land enough to drive a nail into it. He looked at Clara with the patience of a man who has given advice to people who do not intend to take it and who has learned to give it anyway for the sake of the record, so that later when things go as he predicted, he can at least have the cold comfort of having said so. You do not want that land, he said. Whatever is in that water, it has kept every living thing away from the rim of that spring for as long as anyone in this county can remember. The land is cheap because the land is worthless, and the land is worthless because the water is bad. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Why is a spring of water on a piece of ground a curse instead of a blessing? Water is the one thing that makes any land worth owning." He told her that water and good water were two different animals, and that blue water was the kind of thing a sensible body walked away from. She reached into the pocket of her dress and took out the dollar. It was soft, the bill was worn to the texture of a moth's wing, from being folded and unfolded, and carried against a body through all the months of uncertainty that had preceded this moment. She set it on the counter in front of him. Aldous stared at it. He stared at it for longer than was strictly necessary, as though hoping that if he waited long enough, she would reach out and take it back and come to her senses, and the responsibility of what was about to happen would be lifted from his shoulders and returned to the general category of things that had been prevented by good counsel. She did not take it back. He sighed. It was a long sigh, the sigh of a man who has tried and has not succeeded and must now proceed to the documentation. He reached for the deed papers, and the sound of that sigh was the first in a long collection of similar sounds that Clara would gather over the years to come, the small involuntary exhales that people produce when a young woman refuses to be saved from herself. She walked the 4 miles from Pikeville to Grassy Cove with the spring sun on her shoulders and the mountains rising blue-green on every side, the flour sack bumping against her hip, with each step the deed folded into her dress pocket, next to the empty space where the dollar had been. Grassy Cove is not a place that announces itself. It is a great bowl pressed into the Cumberland Plateau, ringed by ridges on every side, and the only way you know you have entered it is a subtle change in the air, in the way the mountains seem to draw closer around you, as though the landscape is watching to see what you intend. The creek that drains the cove does not run to any river you can follow on a map. It disappears into the limestone at the low end, swallowed by the rock, the way the cove swallows everything, taking it down into the dark passages beneath the plateau where rivers run that no human being has ever walked. The eastern edge of the cove where her 2 acres lay was where the flat valley floor ran up against a wall of pale stone. The ground was mostly level, which was a mercy, but it was thin and stony and freckled with scrub grass, and a handful of cedar trees that grew bent and gnarled as though they had spent their entire lives losing an argument with the wind and had made their peace with the losing, but not with the wind. There was no cabin, no fence worth the description, no sign that any of the dozen owners who had held this land since before the war had ever believed in it enough to commit more than a minimal and retreating presence to it. The last man, she would learn later, had taken one look and driven away without unpacking his wagon. And then she saw the spring. It sat at the foot of the bluff, where the limestone rose up gray and pale into the afternoon sky, and the water came pushing up out of a crack in the rock, with the patient, unhurried steadiness of something that had been doing exactly this for longer than there had been a county to name it. It collected in a basin perhaps 10 feet across, and the water in the basin was blue. Clara stopped walking. She stood at the edge of where the scrub grass gave way to the bare stone around the pool, and she looked at the water and she understood immediately why people had been afraid of it. It was not the blue of a clean sky resting on still water. It was blue the way a thing is blue when something fundamental about it has gone different from the expected, a deep and luminous color that leaned toward turquoise, where the afternoon light struck its surface and sank into bruised indigo in the shadow of the bluff. It looked like the pool in an old story, the kind of pool that the witch in the story tells the lost children never to drink from, under any circumstances, because the witch knows that the instruction will function as an invitation, and the lost children will drink and something will happen and the story will proceed. Clara approached it the way you approach anything that frightens you and fascinates you at the same time, slowly, with her hands open and visible, as though the water might rear back if she moved too quickly. She knelt at the rim of the pool. The stone was cold under her knees even in the spring afternoon, because the water that came out of the rock was cold in a way that the air and the sun had not yet touched cold from its long passage through the dark interior of the mountain, where no season reaches and no warmth penetrates. She looked down into the basin. She could see the bottom. 6 feet down, perhaps, at the deepest point, the small stones on the floor wore a pale frost of mineral deposit that caught the light and returned it in tiny sparks. The overflow ran off the lower edge of the basin in a thread of water that crossed her land for 100 yards and then vanished into another seam in the limestone, the cove reclaiming its own water the way it reclaims everything in the end. She leaned forward and cupped her hands and lifted the water to her face and breathed it in. No sulfur, no copper, no rotten egg stink of bad mineral, no metal bite on the back of the throat. It smelled of stone and of cold, and beneath that something faintly sweet that she could not name a sweetness, with no flower behind it and no fruit, only the mineral ghost of what the mountain had dissolved into the water over the long years of its passage through the rock. Mrs. Dean, had she been standing at Clara's shoulder, would have struck the water from her hands and lectured her until the sun went down on the other side of the ridge. You do not drink what you cannot name. You do not drink water that cattle refuse to approach. You do not drink from a basin that the whole country has avoided for 100 years. But Mrs. Dean was in the cold ground behind the Cumberland home, and Clara was thirsty in a way that went deeper than her throat, thirsty for proof that her own senses could be trusted over the inherited fears of people who had never bothered to look closely at the thing they were afraid of. She drank. The cold of it was a physical event. It hit her teeth and her chest and made her draw a sharp breath, and then it settled, and what she tasted was water. Clean water. Water with that mineral sweetness at its center, the taste of limestone and of time, the flavor of a mountain's long, slow gift to the surface world. The blue, whatever the blue was, whatever chemistry the mountain had worked into the water on its passage through the dark, had no flavor that she could find. She was still kneeling, still alive. Her belly did not cramp, her vision did not swim, her head did not ache. She drank again. And the second time she drank from that spring, there was already something different in the act, because the first time had been a test, and the second time was a choice. A deliberate and considered choice made by a girl who had just decided on the evidence of her own tongue and her own uninjured body that 100 years of fear in that valley had been founded on nothing more substantial than the color of the water and the stubbornness of cattle, and that she was going to live her life on the testimony of what she could actually observe, rather than on the inherited certainty of people who had never knelt and looked. She rose. She found a place beneath the twisted cedars where the ground was relatively level, and she unpacked the flour sack and she began making something that resembled a camp, weighting the corners of her canvas tarp, with stones building a fire ring from the limestone that lay everywhere underfoot, learning which of the dead branches produced clean smoke and which produced only a thick and acrid smoldering. The spring talked to itself all through that first evening. It was not loud, the sound it made. It was the kind of sound you stop noticing when you are busy and start noticing again when you are still, a low and patient murmur that seemed to come from underneath the world rather than from the surface of it, a sound that was old in the way that only the sounds of water and stone are old. Clara lay under her canvas as the dark came down from the ridges and listened to it. She had a flour sack. She had a deed to 2 acres of ground that nobody had wanted for 3 years. She had the memory of a dead woman's voice telling her things about soil and light, and the endless bargain between a plant and the earth that holds it. She had a pair of hands that knew how to work. She had the complete and absolute necessity of making something from what she had, because there was nothing else, and nowhere else, and no one coming. And she had in the very bottom of the flour sack, wrapped in the only dress she had not been wearing, when they put her out, a single tin can with holes punched through the bottom, and a tomato seedling in it that she had been tending for 6 weeks in secret, carrying it out of the Cumberland home, the way a woman carries a stolen jewel pressed between folded cotton, hidden from the matron, who would have called it unsanitary, and the administrator, who would have called it theft. It was Mrs. Dean's seed. The old woman had been saving it for years, a great rib purple-shouldered variety that she had nursed through one summer after another, selecting each year for the largest and most flavorful fruit, building something through patient annual attention that was in its way a kind of art. Clara had watched her do it. She had pressed that particular seed into a particular handful of soil 6 weeks before the matron told her that her time at the home had ended, and she had kept the seedling alive through the intervening weeks with the careful rationing of water from a cup she smuggled twice a day. Planting it anywhere but in her own ground would have felt like a betrayal of the only person who had ever believed she had a brain worth feeding. The next morning she planted it. She chose a spot 15 feet from the rim of the pool in the damp strip of ground where the overflow creek kept the thin soil from going entirely to dust. She pressed the seedling into the earth with the careful deliberateness that Mrs. Dean had modeled 1,000 times, firming the soil around the roots without compacting it, leaving the surface loose enough for air. She hauled water from the spring in a dented bucket that Aldous had let her take from a pile behind the assessor's office, an act of guilty generosity that she had accepted without thanks, because thanks would have cost her the bucket. She poured the blue water slowly around the base of the plant. Not on the leaves. Never on the leaves, Mrs. Dean had said. always at the base where the roots can reach it and where the sun cannot cook it into a lens that burns. Then she told herself she expected nothing. The season was too far advanced. The soil was too poor. The plant was too small. There were too many reasons it would fail, and the sensible thing was to hold the expectations somewhere between modest and non-existent, so that the failure when it came would not take the last of something vital from her. But some stubborn corner of her, the same corner that had laid the dollar on Aldous' counter, was watching that seedling the way a mother watches a sick child through the turning of a fever, measuring each morning's slight changes against the hope that the crisis had already passed without anyone announcing it. 6 days later, she stood over the tomato plant in the gray light before sunrise, and she could not speak. The seedling was not merely growing, it was reaching upward with a velocity that her mind kept reaching for the word wrong to describe, because it was so far outside the range of what she had witnessed in 4 years of careful attention to Mrs. Dean's garden that her understanding of normal had not yet expanded far enough to hold it. In 6 days, it had nearly doubled in height. The stem had thickened in a way she could verify by touching it, not the slender thread she had pressed into the soil 6 days ago, but something with substance and rigidity that surprised her fingers. The leaves had broadened and gone darker, a deep and saturated green that made the pale scrub grass around it look like something that had given up. Through the wall of the tin can, she could see the suggestion of roots pressing outward, as though the plant had been starved its entire short life, and had finally arrived at a feast it intended to make full use of. She stood there in the dawn chill with her breath fogging in the cold air. The spring threw off the pool, and one thought rose up through everything else with the clarity of a struck bell. It was the water. Not the soil, which was thin and stony, and had done nothing for the scrub grass that had clung to it for years. Not the sun, which fell on this spot the same way it fell on every other spot within a mile. Not any special quality of her planting, because she had planted with the same care she would have brought to any ground. The only thing she had given this plant that the ground around it did not receive was the blue water carried up from the crack in the limestone and poured slowly around the roots twice a day. And the plant was answering it. She needed more evidence. She was not a woman who trusts a single witness, not even one shouting as loud as that tomato plant. She went to work the same morning planting beans and squash and peppers and hills of corn and rows of lettuce, and she split each planting deliberately and cleanly down the middle. One half she gave the blue spring water hauled by the bucket from the pool. The other half she gave the rain she caught in a barrel beneath a slope of canvas, the same plain water that fell on every farm and field in the cove. Same seed from what little she had, same soil, same hands, same sun walking the same arc overhead. The only variable between the two halves of each planting was the color of what she poured at their roots. The weeks that followed were the most attentive of her life, more attentive even than her years of following Mrs. Dean down the rows of the kitchen garden, because then she had been learning, and now she was measuring, and the difference between learning and measuring is the difference between listening to a story and deciding whether it is true. The spring-watered half of every planting came up faster, stood taller, leaf darker and thicker than the controls beside them. When the fruit and the pods began to come in, they were larger by a measure that moved past significant and approached the territory of the barely believable. She was not imagining it. She was not hoping herself into a reading of the evidence that the evidence did not support. The gap between the two halves of every row was visible to anyone who stood at the end of the planting and looked down its length, a living record of what the mountain had been releasing into that crack in the rock for longer than anyone in the valley had been alive to ignore it. When the first great tomato finally ripened in the last days of June, it had grown to a size that she had to hold in two hands. It was deep red, gone purple at the shoulder, in the way Mrs. Dean's variety always went at full ripeness, and it was heavy with the weight of something that had been allowed to become entirely what it was meant to be, given everything it needed and nothing it did not. She sat on the rough step of her lean-to shelter, and she bit into it. The juice ran down her chin and her wrist and dropped into the dust at her feet, and the flavor that filled her mouth was so far beyond what she had believed a tomato could contain that she laughed. It was not a simple or comfortable laugh. It was the helpless, slightly undone laughter of a person whose understanding of the possible has just been struck down and is not yet sure what will replace it. The laughter of someone discovering that the world is larger and stranger and more generous than every authority she had ever encountered had sworn it was. She understood sitting there alone on her little step with the tomato juice drying on her hands, what no one in 100 years of careful avoidance had ever bothered to discover. The water was not poison. The water was the richest natural fertilizer that the Cumberland Plateau had spent a geological age, quietly brewing in its dark interior and releasing for free to anyone willing to get close enough to cup it in their hands and find out what it tasted like. As it traveled mile after mile through the limestone beneath the cove, it had been dissolving the very bones of the mountain, taking on calcium and potassium and phosphorus and a dozen trace minerals. Besides arriving at the surface loaded with a cargo of nourishment that a prosperous farmer would have spent a considerable sum to approximate by hand. And the cove had been pouring it back into the ground for a century, untouched and undrunk and ungiven because the color of it frightened them. The reason nothing grew near the spring was the simplest reason available. Nothing that needed what the spring was offering had ever been planted there. The cedar trees and the scrub grass were creatures bred for poor ground. They did not need what the mountain was pouring out, and so they ignored it the way a man dying of thirst ignores the rain because he cannot figure out how to lift his face to the sky. But a cultivated plant, a tomato or a bean or an ear of corn, shaped through generations of human care to respond to rich feeding with maximum abundance, went nearly wild with gratitude the moment that water touched its roots. The spring had never been cursed. It had been waiting. Patient as only stone can be patient. It had been waiting for someone to plant the right kind of seed in the ground, that its overflow dampened, and to pour its blue water at the roots of something capable of answering it, and to see what the mountain had been saving in the dark for so long, holding it out year after year to a valley that could not get past the color of the gift long enough to accept it. She was still sitting on that step, still holding the half-eaten tomato in both hands, when she became aware that she was not alone. At the edge of her 2 acres where the scrub grass met the bare track that passed for a path along the base of the bluff, a boy was standing with a single-shot rifle forgotten in one hand and his mouth slightly open. He was 14 years old, give or take. He had the look of a boy who has spent his life outdoors and has been told so many stories about the piece of ground he was currently standing at the border of that, he expected at any moment to see something that confirmed them. What he was seeing instead was a garden. Not the gray-green of a scrub, barely maintaining its hold on bad ground. A garden. Tomato vines past the height of his shoulders, staked with cedar poles and heavy with ripening fruit. Corn already throwing up its tassels weeks ahead of any field in the valley. Beans climbing their poles with the focused intensity of something that has somewhere specific to be. He stood there for a long time. When he finally spoke, the words came out not as a greeting or a question, but as something closer to an accusation, the tone of a boy confronting a violation of a law he had been raised to believe was unbreakable. "What did you do to the dirt?" Clara looked at him. "I gave it water," she said. He asked if she meant the blue water, and she could hear in the question the inherited fear of a boy who had been warned away from that spring before he was old enough to evaluate the warning for himself. The fear that had been passed down through enough generations that it no longer needed reasons. It only needed the old, low voice of authority saying, "Not that, never that, stay back." "Yes," she said, "the blue water." He backed away a step as though the abundance before him might be contagious. His name was Tommy Akers, and he ran home and told his father, and his father told a neighbor over a shared fence, and the story moved through Grassy Cove the way fire moves through dry grass in August, leaping from porch to porch faster than any one person could carry it. Within a week, families had begun making the walk out to the eastern edge of the cove to see the thing that the boy said could not be there. They came to look. They came to shake their heads. They came to confirm with their own eyes the rumor that their reason rejected because the rumor contradicted 100 years of certainty, and the certainty had the comfortable weight of many generations of agreement behind it. Among them came an old man named Vernon Galt, whose family had worked the floor of that cove since before Tennessee was a state, whose grandfather had been among the first to warn the first settlers away from the Blue Spring, who carried in the set of his jaw and the deliberateness of his walk, the entire accumulated authority of a man who has been proved right about the land often enough that he expects to be proved right about it again. He stood at the edge of her garden. He took in the tomato vines, the corn, the beans. He bent down and pressed his thumb into the soil near the overflow creek and examined what came up on his thumb, and something moved across his face that was not yet an acknowledgement, but was at least the precursor to one, The slight loosening of certainty that occurs when what a man expected to see and what he is actually seeing are clearly different things. Then he picked up one of the ripest tomatoes from the nearest vine. He turned it over in his cracked hands. He looked at it the way a jeweler looks at a stone he suspects is not what he has been told it is, examining it for the flaw that will confirm his skepticism and let him set it down with his judgment intact. But he bit into it. He chewed. He chewed slowly and then more slowly, and then he stopped chewing altogether, and he simply held the tomato away from his face and looked at it as though it had spoken to him in a language he recognized but had not expected to hear from a piece of fruit. "Lord, have mercy," he said, and his voice had gone soft and different, the voice of a man whose certainty has just shifted its weight from one foot to the other. "That is the finest tomato I have ever put in my mouth." It was the first time in Clara Mabin's 16 years of living that a grown man of Grassy Cove had told her she was right about something. He did it with red juice on his chin and 100 years of his family's fear cracking quietly somewhere behind his eyes, and she received it with the stillness of a person who has been waiting for exactly this moment without knowing that she was waiting for it. But she did not let herself fully feel the warmth of it because she had noticed something. At the far edge of her lot, beyond the garden, in the overflow creek, in the bent cedar trees, a man was standing. He was broad in the shoulder and well-fed in a way that no working farmer in Grassy Cove was well-fed. His coat was too fine for the dust of the back road. His boots were untouched by any honest field. He had not come forward to taste the fruit. He had not shaken his head with the others or spoken a word to anyone. He stood apart from the gathering the way a man stands apart when he is not watching the spectacle that everyone else is watching. He was watching something else. His pale eyes were moving over the garden, in the spring, in the bluff above the spring, in the deed lines of the lot, with the systematic interest of a man performing a calculation. When he had seen enough, he turned and walked back toward the road without looking at Clara once. Not because he had not noticed her, but because in his estimation, it was not yet necessary for him to be noticed. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it within the week, and when she learned it, she would understand that the afternoon's warmth, Vernon Galt's juice-stained chin in his honest bewilderment, and his first reluctant acknowledgement that the cursed girl had done something real, had been observed by a man who had never in his life seen a thing of value belonging to someone weaker without immediately beginning to calculate how it might be moved into his own possession. His name was Silas Mercer, and the war for the water had already begun in that man's patient and systematic mind before Clara had finished wiping the tomato juice from her hands. She lay down under her canvas that night, and she could not sleep for the turning of her own thoughts. Somewhere across the cove, she was already certain another person was also lying awake, turning over the same green abundance. She was turning over, wanting the opposite thing from it. She wanted to grow. He wanted to own. And between those two desires across the years that were coming, a whole war would be fought over a basin of blue water that she had bought for $1 from a man who had told her she did not want it. He had been wrong about that. They had all been wrong about that. The way fear is always wrong when it dresses itself in the coat of good sense and tries to talk you out of the only thing worth having. She had wanted that land more than she had ever wanted anything in her life. And now at last, she knew why. Part 2. The War for the Water. The second year begins the way all second years begin, quietly without announcement, the way a river rises in the night, so that by morning the change is already accomplished, and what you are looking at is not the crossing of a threshold, but the established fact of having crossed it. By the spring of 1882, Clara Mabin had a garden that the whole of Grassy Cove had heard about, and a reputation that the whole of Grassy Cove could not quite decide what to do with. She was not yet 18 years old. She had slept through one full winter under a canvas lean-to that she had improved incrementally through the cold months, adding cedar walls on 3 sides, banking the base with limestone rubble for insulation, learning the particular and unforgiving curriculum of a Tennessee winter, when your shelter is the thing you built with your own hands from whatever the land around you offered. She had not been warm, but she had been alive, and the spring had not stopped flowing, and by February she had been studying the overflow creek with the focused attention of someone who understands that the cold months are when you plan what the warm months will reveal. The garden she planted in the spring of 1882 was 4 times the size of the first one. She had expanded the irrigated ground in every direction the overflow creek could be coaxed to reach. Digging shallow channels with a mattock, she had traded a half-bushel of stored squash for learning the subtle topography of her 2 acres, the way a ship's navigator learns a coastline, one careful sounding at a time. Every foot of ground that the blue water could be made to touch was planted. What she could not irrigate with the spring, she did not plant at all, because the experiment she had run the previous summer had settled that question beyond any appeal she was willing to entertain. The evidence was not complicated. The spring water grew things that the rainwater could not approach. That was the whole of it. The how of it would come later in the explanation of a man with instruments she had never imagined. The fact of it, she already knew with the complete and unargued certainty of a person who has run the test honestly and read the result without flinching. She loaded her first handcart of the season in June and walked it to the crossroads at the center of the cove, where the wagon road from Pikeville met the track that wandered up toward the high farms. The store at the crossroads was run by a man named Puit, pronounced with the accent on the second syllable, in the way of certain old Tennessee families who had been mispronouncing their own names for so many generations that the mispronunciation had become the name. Puit was a cautious man in the way that merchants in small communities become cautious, having learned that every transaction in a place where everyone knows everyone has social consequences that extend well beyond the exchange of goods for money. He looked at Clara's tomatoes the way he looked at most things that arrived at his counter without prior announcement, with a skepticism that was not hostile, but was thorough. He had heard about the garden the way everyone in Grassy Cove had heard about it. He had heard about the blue spring water, and he had heard the old stories about the blue spring, and he was a man who had enough competing information to be uncertain, which in his experience was the most commercially dangerous condition a merchant could occupy. He would not buy outright. He would allow her to set the produce on the porch on consignment, taking his percentage of whatever sold with the unspoken understanding that he expected very little to sell, and that the arrangement was therefore more charitable than commercial in nature. By the second Saturday, the porch had been swept clean by noon. Puit's uncertainty shifted in the way that merchant uncertainty always shifts. When the evidence comes in undeniable and financial, it became something that looked a great deal like enthusiasm, or at least like the commercial approximation of enthusiasm, which is the recognition that a thing previously undervalued has turned out to be worth considerably more than estimated. The families who had walked out to gawk at Clara's garden the previous summer were now walking to the crossroads to buy what it produced. And what they were tasting when they bit into her fruit was not simply size, though the size was remarkable. It was concentration. It was the difference between a tomato that has been given everything it needed and a tomato that has been given only what was available, which turns out to be a flavor difference so distinct that the people of Grassy Cove, none of whom had the vocabulary of professional food writers, expressed it in the only way available to them. They kept coming back. Vernon Golt's wife, who had been putting up the Cove's harvest in canning jars for the better part of 40 years, put up a batch of Clara's tomatoes into a sauce and told anyone who would listen that her husband had wept at the supper table over a bowl of it. Clara could not vouch for the tears. She could vouch that the story traveled because that is the nature of stories about food. In communities where food has always been close enough to the edge of insufficient, that abundance is still understood as grace. She had a second trade running alongside the produce by midsummer. She filled clean glass jars with water drawn from the pool and set them on Puit's porch beside the vegetables. 5 cents each. The label said garden water because the blue color still turned enough stomachs among people who had been raised on the old stories that calling it what it was would have slowed the selling. A handful of households bought a jar and tried it on their own tired plots, and the results came back to her through Puit. The way all news of consequence came back to her secondhand and a little breathless with surprise. Whatever they poured it on grew faster than the same seed under well water or rain. The mountain's gift traveled in a jar as well as it traveled in a creek. Old Hale came to her in the late summer of that second year. He was a beekeeper of the old school, a man who had kept hives on the high south-facing slope above the cove for 50 years, and who understood bees the way Mrs. Dean had understood soil, as something alive and legible to those who paid the right quality of attention. He was weathered in the specific way of men who spend their working lives outdoors, in a landscape that does not moderate its conditions for human comfort, and he had the patient, slightly distant manner of someone whose best conversations have always been with creatures that do not use words. He had noticed something he told Clara that his 50 years of beekeeping had not prepared him to account for. His hives on the slope above had always worked the cove below them, ranging out across the fields and orchards in the ordinary way of bees following the ordinary seasonal logic of blossom and nectar, and the distance a colony can efficiently cover. But since Clara's garden had come into its full summer production, something had changed. His bees were making the trip to her lot from a mile distant, with a frequency and purposefulness that exceeded anything he had seen from them before, and they were coming home from it in a state that he described after a moment's consideration of the right word as drunk. Heavy, he said, laden in a way that made their flight different, and working her late blossoms with a frenzy that had no precedent in his experience. "Whatever is in your flowers," he said, his weathered face arranged in an expression of wonder that sat a little awkwardly on features more accustomed to stoic assessment. "My girls have gone drunk on it. I have never seen them labor so hard, nor come home so heavy." He asked permission to move several of his hives down to the edge of her lot, where the blossoms ran richest. Clara gave it without hesitation, because Mrs. Dean had taught her that a garden without bees is a church without a congregation. The structure may be beautiful, but the purpose of the thing requires more than one species to be fulfilled. The honey those hives produced was a thing entirely apart from any honey the cove had ever jarred. Amber going on gold, thick enough to hold the shape of a spoon's passage for several seconds before it closed back over itself, carrying in its flavor a complexity that seemed to hold every flower in Clara's garden at once, with underneath it all a clean mineral note that no one could name precisely, but that no one could stop reaching for another taste of. Old Hale called it blue honey, half in jest at first, because the color of it in certain lights had a quality that reminded him of the spring. But the name stuck the way true names always stick, with the adhesion of accuracy, and the blue honey began to outsell every other comb at the crossroads within the season. 3 trades running from 2 acres of ground that nobody had wanted. Clara was sleeping under improved cedar walls instead of raw canvas. She had a proper fire pit with a stone surround. She had shelves of her own construction holding the canned surplus of a harvest that continued to exceed her capacity to preserve it. She was not yet 18 years old, and she was not yet comfortable, but she was something more important than comfortable. She was rooted. And Silas Mercer had been watching. He came on a morning in the early spring of 1882, when the garden was still mostly promise, and the first plants of the new season were only inches out of the ground. He came without announcement because men like Silas Mercer understand that announcements give the other party time to prepare, and preparation shifts the balance of a negotiation in a direction that such men prefer to prevent. Clara heard his horse on the path before she saw him, and she stood up from where she had been working the soil around a row of pepper seedlings, and she looked at the man who came around the base of the bluff on a horse that was better than anything else in Grassy Cove. And she recognized him immediately as the man who had stood at the edge of her lot the previous summer with the pale eyes and the calculating stillness. He was perhaps 50 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had once done physical labor and whose body still carried the structure of it, even though the labor itself had been replaced long ago by the labor of managing other men's labor. His face was clean-shaved and composed with the particular smoothness of a man who has spent decades ensuring that his expressions reveal only what he intends them to reveal. His coat was wool of a quality that said he had ordered it from somewhere that was not Pikeville. He admired the garden. He did it thoroughly and with apparent sincerity, moving his gaze across the rows and the spring and the limestone bluff above it, with the attentiveness of someone who is genuinely interested in what he is looking at. But the quality of the interest was the quality of a man assessing an asset rather than appreciating a landscape, and Clara, who had spent the past year learning to read everything that grew in her ground, was not unable to read what was growing in his face. He introduced himself as Silas Mercer, neighbor and man of business. She already knew because in the months since the summer before she had learned a great deal about Silas Mercer. She had learned that he held deeds to more land in Grassy Cove than any 3 families combined. She had learned that he had assembled those holdings over 25 years of patient acquisition, buying out farmers whose bad seasons had run long enough to make their deeds negotiable, renting back to the families who remained on terms that were fair enough to prevent open resentment, but tight enough to ensure that the resentment stayed private. She had learned that the farmers who worked his rented acres spoke his name quietly, the way you speak of weather you can see coming but cannot stop. He said that her garden was impressive. He said it the way he might say that a well-constructed bridge was impressive, acknowledging the engineering without any particular warmth toward the engineer. Then he asked, as though it were the most natural courtesy in the world, whether she had ever considered selling. He named a figure. The figure was large enough that it took the breath from her, not in the way that a blow takes the breath, but in the way that a sudden view from a high place takes it, the momentary suspension of ordinary biological function in the face of something that exceeds ordinary scale. It was more money than she had heard described in a single sentence in her life. It was enough to buy a real farm with level bottom land anywhere in 3 counties. It was enough to render unnecessary everything she had built and was building to dissolve it into cash and begin something entirely different in a different place under different and less contested conditions. She understood in the moment of hearing it that the figure was the trap. A man like Silas Mercer does not offer a fortune for 2 acres of stony ground unless he has already calculated that the ground will return him 10 fortunes once the person who does not understand what she is sitting on has been moved gently and generously out of the way. She understood exactly what she was sitting on. She told him that she had bought the lot for $1 and intended to be buried in it. She said it lightly because she had learned by then that lightness can carry as much weight as gravity and is considerably harder to argue with. He laughed. It was a courteous laugh, the laugh of a man who has heard a charming position before and is willing to wait for it to become less charming under the pressure of continued reality. Then the lightness left his voice. This water, he said, his pale eyes meeting hers for the first time in the conversation with the directness of a man who has decided that the preliminary pleasantries have served their purpose, is the most valuable thing in this cove. And you cannot hold it. A girl alone, no deed older than a season, no family to back her claim. Sell to me now while the offer is generous. There was no threat in it. That was the part that she felt most clearly, the part she carried longest in the days that followed. There was no menace in his voice and no cruelty in his expression. There was only the calm, unbothered certainty of a man who has broken other people before this one and has found the process reliable and expects it to proceed in the usual fashion. She told him the deed was as good in her hand as it would be in his, that the dollar she had paid was as legal as any 1,000 he might offer, that the land and the water and the spring were not for sale at any figure he could name. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not anger and was not frustration, but was something more interesting than either the expression of a man recalibrating the expected timeline of an outcome he still considers inevitable. He tipped his hat. He said good day. He rode back down the path with the unhurried composure of a man who has many plans and has learned through long practice that when one approach is unavailing, the intelligent response is not to press it, but to reach for the next one. She watched him go, and she knew with a cold and absolutely certain knowledge that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with clear-eyed assessment that she had not seen the last of him. She had seen only the most agreeable version of him she would ever see. The rumor arrived before she heard his name in it. It moved through the cove the way all damaging things move through small communities, not as a single statement from a single source, but as a kind of atmospheric shift. A change in the quality of the air that you notice first, in the way people look at you before they look away, in the slight adjustment of posture, when you approach a conversation that was ongoing a moment before, in the new hesitation at Puig's counter when she came to collect what had sold. The substance of it, when she finally extracted it from the reluctant half-sentences of a farm wife who liked Clara well enough to be ashamed of what she was repeating, was this: the blue water, which had always been spoken of as strange and possibly dangerous, had begun to produce consequences. A child on a farm at the far end of the cove had taken sick after eating from a garden irrigated with water drawn from one of Clara's jars. A man's hogs had died under circumstances that his neighbors were connecting quietly and with the particular tenacity of rural communities that understand livestock mortality as a serious economic event to the produce he had been feeding them. She went looking for the sick child. There was no sick child. She went looking for the dead hogs. There were no dead hogs. There was no farm at the far end of the cove where these things had occurred. And when she pressed for the name of the family, the name shifted. And when she pressed for the location shifted. And what she was left with was a story that had the structural integrity of smoke, present and real seeming, until you reached for it directly, at which point it was already somewhere else. She understood what had happened. And the understanding hit her in a place that Mercer's offer had not reached, because his offer had been a negotiation, and this was something different. This was an attack on the thing she had built, not by attempting to acquire it, but by attempting to convince the community that it was dangerous, that the abundance she had created was actually a harm she was either knowingly or negligently inflicting on the people around her, that the orphan girl's generosity was in fact a kind of poison wearing the mask of a gift. The trade at Puig's crossroads thinned within a single Saturday. The jars of blue water went unsold on the porch. Families who had walked miles for her tomatoes now walked past them with their eyes pointed carefully in another direction, the way people look away from something they want to ignore without appearing to have made the choice to ignore it. Pruitt himself suggested, with the careful indirection of a man protecting a commercial interest, that perhaps the arrangement they had established might need to be reconsidered, that the conversation around the cove had become somewhat complicated, that perhaps she might find another location for her selling. Clara stood in her garden that evening with the unsold jars lined up beside her in the last light, and she felt for the first time since she had laid her dollar on Aldous' counter, the old fear beginning its familiar ascent up her spine. The fear that the world would always find a way to take from the girl, with nothing whatever small and hard-won things she had managed to make from the materials available to her. The fear that effort and honesty and the evidence of her own senses were not sufficient, that they never had been, that what determined outcomes in the world was not what was true, but what the powerful could make others believe. She stood with that fear for a long time. Then she thought of Mrs. Dean. She poured out nothing. She discarded nothing. She went to bed and she lay in the dark and she listened to the spring and she made her decision. The following Saturday, she loaded the handcart with the finest produce her garden had ever yielded. The great purple-shouldered tomatoes that weighed nearly a pound each, so heavy the vines had to be restaked after a rain. Peppers like red lanterns, squash that a grown child could not lift one-handed. She loaded all of it and she walked it to the crossroads, not to sell it but to give it away. Every family that came past, every person who stopped to look or to look away. She pressed the fruit into their hands and she ate from each piece herself. First took a full deliberate bite and chewed and swallowed in full view before she handed it over so there could be no ambiguity about what she was willing to put in her own body. "If this water is death," she said, pitching her voice to carry to the full porch and the gathering of people who had drifted toward the activity, the way people drift toward any public demonstration of something they cannot yet categorize, "then I have been dying for 2 years. And I have never felt more alive in my life." It was not enough to win them back immediately, because a rumor with money and calculation behind it does not die on a single Saturday afternoon. But it planted a seed in the doubt, a crack in the consensus, and the cove began to produce a counter-whisper. That the orphan girl ate her own produce without hesitation. That she gave away freely what a poisoner would hoard. That the sick child and the dead hogs had no farm and no family name attached to them that anyone could actually locate. Clara had learned something from Mercer's rumor that he had not intended to teach her. He had shown her that fear travels on stories, that a poison can be manufactured entirely from words, and that the only true antidote to a poison story is to stand in the open and let people watch you live. It was a lesson that would have cost her everything to learn at the wrong moment, and that she had learned by luck and stubbornness at the right one. But she needed more than a brave Saturday. She needed a truth large enough and authoritative enough to stand against a wealthy man's persistent campaign of manufactured doubt. She needed the weight of something that Silas Mercer could not buy and could not whisper away. Dr. Elliot Shaw arrived at the beginning of that same summer on a hired horse, with a leather case strapped behind his saddle, wearing the careful gray clothing of a man who spends his working days indoors with books, rather than outdoors with weather, and who has made his peace with the fact that these two kinds of life produce different kinds of knowledge, and that one of them is his. He was a professor of natural philosophy and mineral chemistry at the State University in Knoxville, and he had ridden nearly 2 days to see for himself a thing that had climbed out of Grassy Cove and reached the ears of the Agricultural Society in his county, which had heard it from a correspondent in Pikeville, who had heard it from Vernon Galt, who had not been able to stop talking about a tomato for the better part of a year. He introduced himself with none of the flat commercial assessment that Clara had learned to dread in the months since Mercer's visit. His eyes moved across the garden and the spring and the bluff with the bright, restless quality of a man who has spent his life asking the same question she had asked over Mrs. Dean's Eastern bean row, the simple and dangerous question of why. Not what, not how much, not what is it worth. Why? He asked if he might stay several days, test the water and the soil and the fruit. He asked permission, which was itself a thing she had to stop and absorb for a moment, because permission was not the customary approach of men who arrived on good horses with professional purposes and the implied authority of institutions behind them. She said yes. He spent 3 days on her land with instruments she had never seen before. Glass tubes that changed color in the presence of certain dissolved minerals. Small folded papers that served as chemical indicators. a brass balance of extraordinary delicacy for weighing things finer than her eyes could discriminate. He drew water from the pool at different hours of the morning and the afternoon. He dug soil from the beds near the spring and from the untouched ground at the far edge of the lot, and laid them side by side on a piece of oilcloth with labels written in his small, precise hand. He cut open her tomatoes and weighed the flesh and the seeds separately, and made columns of figures in a cracked leather notebook. He spoke while he worked, mostly to himself, in the way of a person who thinks more clearly when the thoughts are audible, and Clara followed him through those 3 days, the way she had once followed Mrs. Dean down a kitchen garden row, gathering up an education that no institution in the state had designed to be available to her. On the evening of the third day, he packed his case and made ready to ride back to Knoxville. He would send word, he said, when his analysis was complete. He estimated several months. He thanked her for her time and her patience, and he said, almost as an afterthought, standing at the stirrup of his hired horse, with the last light coming red off the limestone bluff above them, that he had not in 20 years of examining springs and soils, and the relationship between them, seen anything that had given him quite this immediate an impression of significance. He rode away down the path, and Clara stood in the long evening shadow of the bluff and held that word in her mind. Significance. From a man who had no reason to use it carelessly. The waiting stretched through the rest of that summer and into the autumn, and into the waiting, Silas Mercer poured a fresh supply of poison. The professor, the new rumor went, had come to confirm what the cautious families of the Cove had always suspected. The university itself would soon declare the spring a chemical hazard. Any family still buying the orphan girl's water was buying a future of sick children and failed crops, and the wise course was to pour out whatever jars remained and make no further purchases until the matter was officially resolved. It was the cleverest thing Mercer had done, and it was also the most desperate because it revealed the shape of his fear. He was borrowing the authority of the science that was coming to undo him, wrapping his lie in the borrowed credibility of an institution whose actual conclusion would strip his lie bare the moment it arrived. It was the move of a man who understood that he was losing ground and had decided that the only remaining play was to try to claim the verdict before the judge delivered it. Clara heard the new rumor and felt something settle in her, something that had been unsteady through the weeks of waiting and the thin Saturdays at the crossroads and the careful distance of neighbors who had not yet decided which story to believe. It settled because she recognized the desperation in the tactic, and desperation in a powerful man is a different thing from desperation in a powerless one. In a powerful man, it is evidence that the power is being spent down. She went back to work. She tended the garden through the autumn with the full attention it deserved, putting the beds to sleep with the careful preparation Mrs. Dean had taught, laying compost over the springside rows, pruning and staking and reading the ground the way her teacher had read it, with hands and eyes, and the accumulated understanding of years. And she waited for the judge to speak. Dr. Shaw's letter arrived in October, followed by the man himself 2 weeks later, riding up her path in the cool of an early autumn morning, with his face arranged in an expression she had not seen on it before. It was the expression of a scientist who has found something genuinely new and has not yet fully accustomed himself to the dimensions of his own, finding a quality of contained excitement that showed around the edges of his professional composure, the way light shows around the edges of a closed door. He sat on the step of her cedar shelter, and he spread his notes across his knees, and he told her what the mountain had been doing in the dark. The blue color, he said, came from a mineral called vivianite, an iron phosphate that forms in the deep limestone under conditions of no oxygen, where the chemistry of reduction rather than oxidation governs what is possible. It dissolves into the water that passes through it, and in sufficient concentration, it produces exactly the color that had frightened the Cove for 100 years, that deep and luminous blue that looked like a warning and was in fact the opposite of one. The concentration in her spring, he said, was far too low to cause any harm to any living creature. The vivianite was coloring the water the way iron can color a sunset, contributing a quality of appearance without altering anything essential about the substance. The blue was beautiful, and it was harmless, in the same way that a flag is harmless if you consider only the cloth. And what the water itself contained was the part that lit his face with that barely contained excitement, because the vivianite was, as he put it, only the announcement. Behind it, dissolved into the water across miles of passage through the richest limestone formation in the Cumberland Plateau, was a profile of minerals that he had spent 3 months measuring and remeasuring, because the first measurements had seemed too remarkable to accept without verification. Calcium, potassium, phosphorus, iron, and a suite of trace elements whose names he gave her one by one, watching her face to see whether she was following, and finding that she was because she had spent 3 days following him through his work and had understood more of it than he had expected. The water that fed her garden, he said, carried these minerals in a balance that was almost without analogy in any natural source he had ever tested, a balance so close to the ideal profile for supporting the growth of cultivated plants that it could not have been more precisely formulated if a chemist had designed it deliberately. The mountain, in its long and patient dissolution over tens of thousands of years, had produced by geological accident what the best agricultural science of the day was laboring to produce on purpose, and had been delivering it continuously to the surface of the earth at the foot of that limestone bluff, without anyone accepting the delivery for as long as there had been a cove to receive it. This is, he said, setting down his notes and looking at her directly across the basin of blue water, without the least exaggeration, the most fertile natural water I have ever set my instruments against. And every soul in this valley has been running from it for a century because of nothing except its color. She asked him how long it had been doing this, brewing the mountain's minerals into the water and holding them in solution. His answer rearranged something in her understanding that has never fully settled back into its original arrangement. The rain that fell on these ridges in our great-grandparents' time, he told her, is the very water that rises in your pool. It spent a lifetime working its way down through the limestone and back up to the light, gathering what the stone had to give it all the while. The spring is older than the fear that surrounds it. It has been holding out its gifts since before the first cabin was raised in this cove. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the pool at the blue that she had stared down on her first afternoon, and decided to trust with her tongue and her body and her future. He meant to write it down and set it before the learned men of the state in a formal account, he told her. He asked whether she minded her name appearing in it. She told him she minded nothing that put the truth between a liar and his lies. What she did not know yet was how completely that account, when it came, would change the terrain of the war she was in. A man like Silas Mercer could withstand the doubt of his neighbors. He could manufacture counter-rumors to match any rumor. He could outlast a season of thin Saturdays and whispered hesitation and the slow withdrawal of community trust because he had resources and patience and a long history of winning by being the last one standing. But there was a kind of man who is helpless against a truth set down in ink with a learned signature underneath it, helpless. Not because the truth itself is physically stronger than the lie, but because the truth in writing from a recognized authority changes what other people are willing to say out loud and in public, which changes what becomes possible and what becomes impossible in the social world that a man like Mercer depends upon. Mercer was exactly that kind of man. And he understood it too, which was why his next move was not another rumor. His next move was the law. The papers arrived by the hand of a county constable on a gray afternoon in the late autumn of 1882, and the constable looked genuinely uncomfortable delivering them in the way of a man who has been asked to do something that is technically within his duties and morally adjacent to something he would prefer not to be associated with. Clara took the papers and read them at the table she had built from cedar planks over the summer. She read them once quickly and then again slowly, because legal language is designed to be understood slowly by people who have practiced reading it, and she was reading it for the first time without practice. The substance, when she extracted it from the surrounding architecture of formal phrasing, was this. Silas Mercer held the deeds to the land above her lot on the limestone bluff from which the spring descended. The underground passages of the karst formation beneath the cove, through which the water traveled on its long circuit from the surface to the depths, and back again, ran through those upper lots before they reached the crack in the rock that was her spring. He was therefore claiming, under the existing principles of mountain water law, that the spring which surfaced on her land was not her spring at all. It was his water surfacing on her land by geological accident, and the deed she held to the 2 acres of surface ground did not convey ownership of the water that moved beneath it. If the court agreed with him, the spring would be his. He could fence it. He could pipe it to his own land. He could let it run to waste. He could do anything with it that he chose because it would be his, and she would have 2 acres of thin, rocky ground with an empty limestone basin at one end and no legal claim on anything that came out of it. She sat at the cedar table for a long time after she finished reading. The cold that moved through her was different from the cold of the spring water, different from the cold of a winter under canvas. It was the cold of understanding that she had spent 2 years building something real. building it with her hands, and Mrs. Dean's teaching, and the mountain's gift, and her own stubborn refusal to be frightened away from what her senses told her was true, and that all of it might count for nothing against a man with 40 years of paperwork and enough money to argue in front of a judge. She thought of Mrs. Dean. She thought of the garden in the morning light, the overflow creek carrying blue water to the roots of everything she had planted. She thought of the letter that Dr. Shaw was writing in Knoxville. And she understood that the war was not over. The war had, in a sense, only now reached the phase where it would be decided. Everything before this had been the preliminary maneuvering, the establishment of positions. This was the confrontation itself, the moment when the two opposing claims would be placed before a third party, and one of them would be found to outweigh the other. She had one advantage that Mercer had not accounted for. She had the truth. She had the actual demonstrable, scientifically documented truth about what the water was, and where it came from, and what it did, and why no instrument of human property law could rightfully lay claim to a gift that the mountain had been preparing and delivering since before the first deed in the county had been written. And she had a professor in Knoxville who was writing it down. She went out to the spring in the dark of that evening, and she knelt at the rim, and she cupped the blue water in both hands, and she drank. The cold of it was the same cold it had always been. The cold of deep time and dissolved stone, and the long patience of the mountain, moving water from sky to depth to surface again, in a cycle that made human disputes about ownership seem very small and very brief. She drank and she rose and she went back to the cedar table and she began composing a letter to Dr. Elliot Shaw in Knoxville. She asked him to come. She asked him to bring everything he had written. She told him that the water he had measured and the truth he had found in the measuring were about to be tested in a county courtroom in Pikeville, Tennessee, and that she would very much appreciate having his account of things to set against the account of a man who had never once knelt at the rim of that pool and who had spent the past year and a half trying to buy it, rumor it, and now litigate it away from the girl who had bought it honestly and drunk from it and grown her whole life from the ground it made fertile. She sealed the letter. She would send it in the morning. Outside, the spring continued its ceaseless conversation with the limestone patient, and indifferent and utterly unbothered, the way it had been patient and indifferent and unbothered for longer than any human quarrel about its ownership had been imaginable. The mountain had made the water. The mountain would have something to say about who it belonged to. Clara intended to make sure the court heard it. Part 3. What you pass down is what you plant. The courthouse in Pikeville smelled of wood smoke and wet wool, and the particular density of human breath in a room that was holding more people than it was designed to contain. Every bench was filled. People stood along the walls with their shoulders touching. Farmers who had risen before dawn to make the drive in from the far edges of the cove stood 3 deep at the back, their coats still carrying the cold of the morning ride, their faces arranged in the careful blankness that rural people adopt when they are watching something they have strong feelings about and have not yet decided whether to express them. Clara Mabin stood at the plaintiff's table alone. She had no lawyer because she could not afford one, and because the only lawyer in Pikeville who might have considered taking the case on deferred payment had quietly declined after a conversation with someone whose identity she could infer without difficulty. She had the deed that Aldous had written out for her on the morning she placed her dollar on his counter, and she had a letter from a professor at the State University in Knoxville, and she had the complete and uncluttered understanding of what the water was and where it came from and what it had made possible, an understanding she had earned not in a library or a classroom, but on her knees in the dirt beside a blue pool that nobody else had been willing to approach. Silas Mercer sat at the opposing table with a lawyer in a black coat who carried himself with the polished assurance of a man who has argued successfully in rooms like this one many times before and expects to argue successfully in this one. Behind Mercer was a stack of documents, deeds going back 40 years, surveys and assessments and correspondence with county offices, the accumulated paperweight of a man who has been building his legal position for decades and knows how to deploy it. Mercer's posture was the posture of a man who has purchased outcomes before and is present today primarily to observe the transaction complete itself. He sat with his shoulders back and his hands folded on the table before him, and his face composed in the expression of a person waiting with patience for something already settled. He did not look at Clara. The judge was a mountain man of the old kind, deliberate and unhurried in the way of people who have spent their lives in a landscape that does not reward rushing. He had the look of someone who has heard a great many arguments in this room, and has developed a reliable sense of the difference between the ones that are supported by something real and the ones that are supported primarily by the confidence of the person making them. The lawyer in the black coat spoke first. He spoke at length and with skill, constructing his argument the way a mason constructs a wall, one flat stone laid carefully on another until the structure achieved a height that seemed to preclude climbing over it. The argument was this, that under the established principles of water law in the mountain counties of Tennessee, the source of a water determines its ownership, and that the source of Clara Mabin's spring was not on Clara Mabin's land. The water originated in the limestone formation beneath the lots that Silas Mercer had held for 20 years above the bluff. It merely surfaced on her ground by geological circumstance. She had purchased the surface of 2 acres and the natural features visible upon that surface, but she had not purchased and could not have purchased the underground river that fed the spring, because that river ran through another man's stone before it reached her crack in the rock. It was a good argument. Clara had known it would be. She had spent enough of the preceding weeks reading the legal documents and the precedents the lawyer cited to understand that the argument had genuine force, that it was not simply manufactured pressure, but a real interpretation of real law. The kind of interpretation that wins in courtrooms when the only thing standing against it is the word of a girl with soil under her nails and no institutional authority behind her position. When her turn came, she stood. She did not attempt to out-argue the lawyer on his own ground because she was not a lawyer. And the performance of legal reasoning by a person without legal training in front of a judge who has spent years listening to actual legal reasoning is an unconvincing performance at best. She did something different. She asked the court's permission to read aloud a letter from Dr. Elliot Shaw, professor of natural philosophy and mineral chemistry at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. She heard Mercer shift in his chair. It was a small sound, the slight adjustment of a man whose stillness has been interrupted by something unexpected, and she did not look at him when she heard it because she did not need to. She already knew what the sound meant. She had understood from the moment she wrote to Shaw what the letter would mean to a man whose entire campaign against her had been built on the architecture of manufactured doubt, on rumor and innuendo, and the borrowed authority of institutions he had falsely claimed were on his side. A man who fights with darkness is helpless when someone walks in carrying a lamp. She read. Shaw's account was precise and thorough, and written in the careful language of a scientist who understands that his professional credibility is the instrument he is deploying, and who therefore handles it with corresponding care. He described the Vivianite, its chemistry, and its complete harmlessness at the concentrations present in the spring. He described the mineral profile of the water, the calcium and potassium and phosphorus, and the suite of trace elements, and he gave the measurements he had taken and the comparisons he had run against other natural water sources in the region, and he stated without qualification that the water of the Blue Spring of Grassy Cove was the most minerally fertile natural water source he had examined in his professional career. Then he addressed the legal question. He addressed it not as a lawyer but as a geologist, which turned out to be the more relevant expertise. He explained the nature of karst hydrology, the way water moves through limestone country, following the paths that dissolution has opened through the rock over geological time paths that bear no relationship to the property lines drawn by human surveyors on the surface above. He explained that the underground passages of the Cumberland Plateau limestone cannot be mapped with the precision that property law assumes when it speaks of ownership, that water surfacing in a spring cannot be reliably traced to a specific parcel of surface land above, because the water table in karst terrain moves according to the logic of the rock and not the logic of human documentation. And he concluded with a statement that was not a legal opinion because he was not qualified to offer one, but that was a factual statement about the nature of the thing being argued over. And that factual statement had the weight of 20 years of scientific expertise and the institutional credibility of the state university behind it. The spring belongs in every meaningful physical sense to the ground it rises in. The water surfaces where the limestone permits it to surface. No survey of the land above can establish with geological certainty where the source of a spring in karst terrain originates, because the source is not a point but a network, and that network does not respect the lines that human beings draw on the surface of the earth. Clara set the letter down. She looked at the judge, not at Mercer, not at the lawyer in the black coat, not at the packed and silent room behind her. The mountain does not read deeds, she said. Her voice was steady in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of fear and everything to do with the presence of something stronger than fear. the particular steadiness of a person who is standing on ground she has tested and knows to be solid. It pours its gift where it chooses, and it has chosen to pour it onto 2 acres that I purchased honestly and hold honestly. No man can own what the whole earth made over 1,000 years and gave away for free to whoever had the courage to kneel down and accept it. The room was quiet. The judge took the letter from the table and read it again to himself slowly. The lawyer in the black coat rose to object and found himself for what was perhaps the first time in his professional career without a prepared stone to add to his wall, because the wall had encountered a geological reality that was not susceptible to legal argument in the way that legal arguments are typically susceptible to other legal arguments. The judge set the letter down. He looked at Mercer, he looked at Clara, he looked at the letter again. Then he spoke in the plain and measured way of a man who has weighed 2 things and found one of them heavier and sees no reason to decorate the finding with language it does not require. A spring rising on a lawfully purchased and lawfully held lot belongs to the holder of that lot. No claim of underground source unverifiable by any survey or instrument overturns the plain fact of where the water reaches the light of day. The blue spring of Grassy Cove and all the water it produces are the lawful property of Clara Mabin. She heard her own name spoken as the owner of the thing she had built her life upon, spoken in a court of law by a judge in front of the whole assembled community of Grassy Cove, and the man who had spent the better part of 2 years attempting to take it from her, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the morning they put her belongings in a flour sack and walked her to the gate of the Cumberland home very slowly and with considerable relief let go. Mercer left the courtroom without looking at her. His composed posture had cracked into something rigid and effortful, the bearing of a man accustomed to a particular experience of the world who has just encountered a version of it that does not conform to his expectations and has not yet developed the internal resources to manage that gracefully. She knew his fury was not finished. She knew that a defeat sharpens a certain kind of man rather than diminishing him, and that she had won a battle against someone who thought in terms of campaigns. But she had won it in public in front of every family in the cove, and that changed the ground beneath everything that came next. At the back of the crowded room, she had noticed during the reading of the letter a quiet man she did not recognize. He was standing against the wall near the door, and he was not watching the proceedings with the entertained attention of someone who has come for the spectacle. He was watching Clara specifically with the focused and assessing attention of a man who is trying to determine something about a person and has found in the watching what he was looking for. He had sawdust in the seams of his good coat. She did not learn his name that day. She only caught his eye for a moment across the smoky room, and he did not look away the way that almost everyone else had always looked away from the cursed girl. He held her gaze with an expression that was not challenge and was not pity and was not any of the things she had learned to read in the faces of people deciding what category to put her in. It was recognition, the expression of a man who has walked a considerable distance looking for something and has just found it in an unexpected place. Then the crowd was moving toward the doors, and he was gone, and she filed the moment away in the category of things she did not yet have enough information to interpret, and she walked out of the Pikeville courthouse into the cold afternoon light carrying her deed and Dr. Shaw's letter and the verdict of a Tennessee judge. And she turned her face toward Grassy Cove and began the walk home. She found it in the gray light before sunrise the following morning. She had come to the spring the way she came every morning before the coffee had fully boiled, and before the birds had fully decided that the darkness was over the time of day, when the cove was still and the spring's voice was the loudest thing in her 2 acres. The channel that carried the overflow from the pool to the garden beds had been smashed. The fitted stones that she had set with such care along its course were broken and scattered. At the head of the channel where it began at the edge of the pool, something had been poured into the water, a dark substance that had spread from the point of introduction outward into the basin, and the blue water had gone gray and clouded with it. The luminous color she had knelt beside every morning for 2 years, swallowed under a spreading contamination that smelled of tar and rot and deliberate malice. She stood at the edge of the pool and she looked at what had been done to it, and for one full and terrible hour she believed that Mercer had found the way, that none of his previous approaches had found the way to take the spring from her without owning it, by making it into the poison thing the cove had always feared it was, by fulfilling the old story with his own hands in the dark, so that the truth she had spent 2 years building would be buried under the weight of the original lie. She did not cry. She had not cried since the grave behind the Cumberland home where they buried Mrs. Dean. And she did not cry now, but she sat on the cold stone at the edge of the ruined pool for an hour that felt longer than most years, holding the weight of what she was looking at. Then the mountain answered. It answered the way it had been answering for 10,000 years before Clara Mabin was born, and the way it would answer for 10,000 years after she was gone, with the patient, irresistible pressure of water moving through limestone under the weight of gravity and geology, and time pushing upward through the crack in the rock with the same force it had always pushed, indifferent to what floated on the surface of the basin above, concerned only with the physics of its emergence. By the end of the first day, the contamination had thinned at the edges. By the end of the second day, the blue was returning. It came back from the center of the basin first, where the spring pushed up hardest from the crack in the rock, a deepening of the color in the heart of the pool that spread outward hour by hour, as the continuous pressure of clean mineral water from below drove the fouled surface water over the overflow edge and into the creek. By the morning of the third day, the pool was blue, not gray blue or clouded blue, blue the way it had always been, luminous in the morning light, indigo in the shadow of the bluff, the Vivianite doing its ancient and harmless work of coloring water that had earned its color through 10,000 years of patient chemistry in the dark. The mountain had shrugged. That was the only word for what Clara felt, watching the color return, the shrug of something so vastly larger than the grievance directed at it, that the grievance had passed through it like a breath of wind through an oak forest, noticeable for a moment, and then simply gone, leaving the forest exactly as it had been. The whole cove had seen the smashed channel. The whole cove had smelled what had been poured into the pool. And the whole cove, which had spent a year and a half navigating between the competing claims of the orphan girl and the land baron, and had generally tried to stay close enough to the center to avoid choosing sides, explicitly made its choice in the way that communities make their largest choices, not in a meeting or a vote, but in the accumulated private decisions of families sitting around supper tables discussing what kind of people they intended to be. A man who poisons a young woman's well in the night after losing in court is a man who has demonstrated something about his character that no subsequent conduct can fully undo. Mercer's renters began to pay slowly. His neighbors began to greet him briefly. The small transactions of community life, the borrowed tools and the shared labor, and the passed-along information that constitute the actual economy of a rural place, began to route around him the way water routes around an obstacle, finding the path of least obstruction and flowing there instead. He had spent his power trying to break something the mountain refused to let break, and the breaking had come back to him. The man with sawdust in his coat seams appeared at the edge of her lot 1 week after the trial. His name was Ezra Pruitt. He was 28 years old, a carpenter from Crossville who had built things of wood for a decade with the kind of care that the best carpenters bring to their work, the care of someone who understands that a well-fitted joint is a form of honesty, a physical statement that the maker took the thing seriously enough to do it right, when doing it right was harder and took longer than doing it adequately. He had eaten one of her tomatoes from Puig's porch the previous summer, and it had done to him what it had done to Vernon Galt, which was to produce in a practical and unsentimental man an experience of flavor so far outside the ordinary range that the mind reached automatically for an explanation. He had walked the 4 miles out to her lot to find the explanation, and had found the lot empty because she had been in Pikeville dealing with a legal matter. He had walked back and then walked to the courthouse to learn how the legal matter had resolved itself. He had stood at the back of the courtroom and watched her read a letter that changed the legal status of the most valuable water source in 3 counties, and the expression she had caught on his face in the moment their eyes met had been the expression of a man arriving somewhere he had been walking toward without knowing it was the destination. He came with a wagon of cedar lumber, and he made his purpose plain with the directness of a person who has thought carefully about what he wants to say and decided that saying it clearly is more respectful than wrapping it in social performance. He said that a woman who owned the most valuable water in the county ought not to spend another winter under a roof she had built herself from canvas and cedar poles. Not because the roof was inadequate, he added with a glance at the lean-to that acknowledged genuine competence while maintaining his original assessment, but because she deserved better than adequate. Clara looked at him. She told him she had no money to pay a carpenter. He told her he had not asked for any. He said that a man who builds things for other people's purposes, his whole working life develops over time, a desire to build one thing simply because the building of it is worth doing. He said he had been looking for that thing for several years and believed he had found it. She studied him for a long moment. She was experienced enough by then in reading the motives of people who offered her things to understand the difference between an offer that conceals an expectation and an offer that is simply what it presents itself as being. What she read in Ezra Pruitt's face was the second kind. She said he could start on Monday. He built her a cabin that spring with 2 rooms and a porch that faced the limestone bluff so that the morning light came in off the pale stone and filled the front room before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. He worked with the unhurried focus of a man who has internalized the principle that correct work done at the right pace is faster in the end than hurried work that requires correction. And the joints he cut were fitted so closely that they required no nails to hold each piece of wood shaped to receive the next with the precision of long practice and genuine care. He did not talk while he worked beyond what the work required. But in the late afternoons when the light was failing and the tools were put away, he would sit on the growing porch with a cup of water from the spring, and he would talk in the careful and deliberate way of a man who turns each word over before he releases it to make sure it is sound about the things that mattered to him. About wood and the way different species of it behaved under a plane. About the cove and the quality of the limestone and what it told him about the water that moved through it. About the way built things, when they were built correctly, outlasted the intentions of the people who built them and became part of the landscape they stood in. On the day the cabin's roof went on, he knelt at the edge of the pool the way Clara had knelt on her first afternoon on the land. He cupped the blue water in his broad, scarred hands and held it a moment, looking at the color of it, the depth of it, the quality of light it held and returned. "It's beautiful," he said. His voice had the quality of a man whose habitual stillness has been genuinely interrupted by something he was not expecting to feel. Why was the whole cove afraid of this? Because it was different, she said. And people will walk away from a thing they don't understand long before they'll walk away from a thing that's actually harmful to them. Because different feels like danger until you've done the work of understanding it, and most people would rather not do the work. He drank. His teeth did not blacken. His belly did not cramp. He looked at her across the blue water with the expression he had worn at the back of the courtroom, and this time there was no crowd between them to interrupt it. They were married in the early summer of 1886, a small ceremony at the Crossroads Chapel, with Vernon Galt standing as witness, and old Hale's bees humming in the clover of the churchyard. She was 23 years old. She became Clara Mabin Pruitt, a name with a partnership folded into it that she had not known she was building toward until it was already built. Ezra quarried limestone from the bluff in the years after the cabin was finished and laid up raised garden beds along the spring's overflow course so the planting ground would not drown in the wet seasons. He cut a system of shallow channels from fitted stone that carried the blue water evenly to every row so that Clara no longer broke her back hauling it bucket by bucket across the lot. The water found its own way through the courses his hands had cut, the way water always finds its way when someone has taken the trouble to understand how it moves and built accordingly. In the 3rd year of their marriage, he built something she had not asked for, and that turned out to be the most beautiful thing on her 2 acres. He raised a stone house over the pool itself, not to hide the water away, as Mercer might have hidden it, but to protect it with thick walls, and to honor it with a roof of glass panels set into the stone so that the light still fell through onto the surface of the pool, and the blue glow still rose upward through the building on a sunny afternoon, filling the interior the way light fills a chapel when it comes through colored glass. Clara asked him why he had gone to the trouble of glass when plain shingle would have shed the rain just as well. He stood in the doorway of the little stone house and looked at the blue light moving on the water below their feet. "Some things are too beautiful to keep in the dark," he said. "This valley kept it in the dark for 100 years. I won't add one more day to that." 4 children came in the years that followed, and they grew up in the way that children grow up when they are given enough of everything that matters and are allowed to develop the understanding of where enough comes from. They knew the spring the way they knew the porch and the bluff and the sound of their parents' voices as a fundamental feature of the world they inhabited, and they learned its tending the way the children of fishermen learn the sea, not as a lesson, but as a life. The drought came in the summer of 1888 and the summer that followed it without relief. The rain that the plateau depended on failed in a way that the oldest farmers in the cove said they had not seen in their lifetimes, and what that meant in a community that had always lived close enough to the margin that a poor season was a hard one and a failed season was a dangerous one, was that people began to go hungry in ways they were too proud to say directly, but that showed in the thinning of faces and the new quietness of children who had formerly been loud. The creek that drained the center of the cove shrank to a thread. The wells on the high farms dropped below the reach of their buckets. The gardens on the thin marginal ground at the edges of the valley burned in the July heat without moisture to sustain them, and the corn came up stunted and desperate, tasseling weeks too early, in the way that stressed plants reproduce when they sense they are running out of time. Clara's spring did not fail. It poured its blue water up out of the limestone at the same rate it had poured on the morning she first knelt beside it, indifferent to what the sky was or was not doing, drawing on a reservoir so deep in the rock that no drought on the surface could reach it. The garden it fed was green in a way that the surrounding cove was not green visibly and almost painfully abundant against the background of a landscape that was failing, and Clara understood with full clarity what she was holding and what it meant that she was holding it while her neighbors were not. She could have sold the water. The price that desperation will pay for the thing it needs is the highest price available, and there were families in the cove who would have given her everything they had left for reliable access to what her spring was producing. She could have made herself wealthy in the material sense of the word in a single summer, and the justice of it would have been arguable, because she had bought the ground and built the channels and done the work and endured the years of opposition and profit is not inherently wrong. She did none of it. She filled jars until her hands cracked from the work of it, and she lined them on the porch of Puig's Crossroads store with a sign that said, "Take what you need," and she sent Ezra with the wagon to deliver water to the farms at the far ends of the cove, whose horses were too weak to make the trip. She opened her Saturday teaching to every family who would come, showing them how to use the water efficiently, how to build raised beds to conserve what moisture they had, how to apply the composting methods Mrs. Dean had taught her in a way that helped the soil hold water longer between applications. The food production of the cove, which had been collapsing under the weight of 2 seasons without rain, stabilized and then slowly climbed back toward adequacy, sustained by a single spring, and the woman who refused to let her neighbor's hunger become her own profit. Ezra found her late one evening, filling what she calculated was the 30th jar of the day, her back bent and her hands raw, and her face set in the particular expression of a person who has decided what they are doing and has stopped spending energy on the decision. He knelt beside her without speaking for a moment. Then he said, not as a reproach, but as a genuine inquiry from a man trying to understand the person he had married, that she was giving away everything that made her position in the cove exceptional. That the advantage she had built over years of work and contention was flowing out of her channels into other people's fields for nothing. She straightened up. She held a full jar in both hands and looked at it. Mrs. Dean, she said, gave me everything she knew and never asked me for 1 cent in return. She used to say that knowledge kept to yourself is knowledge that dies with you. That the only inheritance worth having is the kind you can give away and still keep. She said the measure of a thing's real value is whether it grows or shrinks when you share it. She handed him an empty jar. I think water is the same as knowing, she said. Hoard it and it goes stagnant. Give it and it runs clean forever. Ezra took the jar. He looked at her for a long moment in the failing light with the expression of a man who has learned something important about the person he thought he already fully understood. Then he dipped the jar into the channel and filled it and set it with the others, and they worked together in the warm dark until the jars were too many to count and the night was too far advanced to see them clearly. The cove did not forget who had carried it through the dry years. This is the kind of debt that rural communities carry silently and pay back over generations, not in money, but in the quality of regard, in the way that a name is spoken and a history is remembered and a person's judgment is deferred to when the matters that count come up for discussion. Clara Mabin Pruitt's name began to be spoken in Grassy Cove, the way the names of people who have genuinely earned their standing are spoken, with a specific weight, a shorthand respect that requires no elaboration. Silas Mercer came to her gate on a September morning some years after the trial, in the kind of autumn light that makes everything look more considered than it is. He was older. The broad shoulders had descended. The fine coat was gone, replaced by something decent and clean, but no longer making any claim to distinction. The boots that had never touched an honest field were scuffed now, and the scuffing looked permanent. He had been selling land for several years to cover debts that his campaign against the spring had generated, and his failing rents had not recovered. And the great holdings that had made him the dominant man in the cove had contracted to something considerably more modest, a process that had been neither sudden nor dramatic, but had had the quality of water wearing stone, unremarkable day by day and unmistakable in the aggregate. He did not ask to come in. He stood at the gate and he told her that he had come on behalf of his son. The son was a young man of perhaps 20, standing a few steps behind his father, with the contained and watchful manner of someone who has learned to be careful in situations his father has created. He had none of his father's hunger in his face. He had instead a quality of patient attentiveness that Clara recognized, because it was the quality of someone who wants to learn something and has the sense to know that wanting to learn it is not the same as knowing it. Mercer spoke without the smoothness that had characterized their earlier encounters. The smoothness had been worn away by years of reduction and the loss of the certainty that had sustained it, and what remained was something rawer and in some ways more honest. He said that he had told his son there was only one teacher in Grassy Cove worth asking for instruction in what the spring could do and how to work with it, and that the teacher was the girl he had spent years trying to ruin. He said it plainly. He did not dress it in euphemism or reframe it as a misunderstanding or suggest that his actions had been more ambiguous than they had been. He stated it as a fact about himself that he had arrived at through the long and uncomfortable process of watching his certainties prove incorrect one by one. Clara looked at him. She thought of the rumor he had paid to have whispered across the cove. She thought of the constable who had come to her door with papers that could have taken everything. She thought of the morning she had found the pool gray and contaminated and had sat on the cold stone for an hour believing it was over. Then she thought of Mrs. Dean and of what the old woman would have said standing in the kitchen garden of the Cumberland home in the spring light, looking at a girl who was trying to decide whether to extend to someone who had done her harm the same quality of honest attention she tried to extend to everything else she was responsible for. "Send him Saturday," she said. "I don't carry grudges against the son for his father's fears. The water never poisoned anyone, Silas. The teaching won't either." The son came every Saturday after that. He had a genuine gift for it, the same quality of careful observation that Mrs. Dean had recognized in Clara across a row of unequal bean plants, the willingness to look at what was actually there, rather than what he had expected or been told to see. Within a season, he was asking questions that Clara had to think about before she could answer, which was the best indicator she knew of a student worth teaching. The sight of a young Mercer kneeling in her garden rows, learning Mrs. Dean's gospel of soil and rotation and the invisible civilization in good earth, was the closest thing to a formal peace that the history between his family and hers was going to produce. It was not forgiveness in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter and more durable, the recognition that what had been done could not be undone, but that what came next was still a choice, and that the choice available to her was whether to let the past determine the future or to let the future be something different from the past. She chose differently. Dr. Shaw's formal account of the Blue Spring was published by the University Press in the spring of 1889, 5 years after he had first ridden up her path on a hired horse, with a leather case and the bright, restless eyes of a man who had spent his life asking why. The account ran to 40 pages and was written in the careful and qualified language of serious science, full of measurements and comparisons, and the methodological precision that separates a scientific claim from a merely enthusiastic one. It presented 5 years of data from her lot and the surrounding cove, comparing yields and mineral content and growth rates across dozens of crops and dozens of seasons, and the numbers it presented were, even to Clara, who had lived inside them, startling in the plainness of their declaration. Yields raised by nearly half on some crops, more than doubled on others in the sustained and repeated growing seasons that eliminated the possibility of anomaly. The nutritional content of the fruit measurably richer than anything grown on ordinary water. The soil itself in the beds that had been irrigated with the spring water for 8 years transformed from the thin and stony ground she had pressed a tin can into in 1881 into something dark and deep and alive, with the invisible nation that Mrs. Dean had taught her to recognize as the true indicator of ground-worth farming. In the acknowledgments written in the same careful professional language as the rest of the document, Shaw thanked the institutions and colleagues who had supported the work. And then he added a paragraph that was not in the language of professional acknowledgement, but in something closer to the language of personal testimony. He wrote that the research would not have been possible without the prior work of a woman who had done without instruments or institutional support what 20 years of academic inquiry had not managed to do, which was to establish through honest empirical observation and rigorous practical testing that the Blue Spring of Grassy Cove was not a danger but a gift. He wrote that he was indebted to Clara Mabin Pruitt, who had the courage to plant where her whole valley feared even to drink, and that the first evidence for everything the study had subsequently proven was a single tomato seedling grown in a tin can and watered from a pool that everyone with authority had told her to avoid. The orphan girl's first tomato standing at the head of the science. The state of Tennessee took notice the following year. The account had moved through channels that such accounts move through, from the university press to the state agricultural board to the offices of people whose function was to identify things of exceptional value in the natural resources of the state and ensure their protection. In 1890, the Blue Spring of Grassy Cove was formally registered as a protected natural resource under state law, its waters designated for the beneficial use of the landowner and the surrounding agricultural community, its integrity protected against the kind of deliberate contamination that had been visited upon it in the night after the Pikeville trial. The 2 acres that Aldous had once tried to talk her out of buying were assessed that year at a figure that would have caused the younger version of him to drop his pen clean off the counter. The cursed lot, the worst piece of ground in the cove, carrying now the highest assessment of any small holding in 3 counties. Pearl Pruitt came home from a church supper in Pikeville one autumn afternoon with her brow furrowed in the expression of a person who has encountered something that does not fit her established understanding of the world. "Mama," she said, "their tomatoes don't taste like anything. They just taste like water." Clara looked at her oldest daughter, who had grown up with the garden the way she herself had grown up with the Cumberland home, not as a choice, but as the given condition of her existence, and who therefore had no reference point for the comparison that made the gift legible. "Those are ordinary tomatoes," she said, "grown on ordinary water. Ours are different because the water is different, and the water is different because of what the mountain put into it over 1,000 years of slow and patient work. That's why you can't find it anywhere else. That's why it matters." Pearl set her jaw in the particular way she had, which was her mother's jaw, set in her mother's way. "Then I never want an ordinary tomato as long as I live," she said. "Good," Clara told her. "Then you had better learn to tend the spring." Pearl learned. All 4 children learned in the way that things worth knowing are learned when they are introduced early and maintained consistently and surrounded by the evidence of their own importance. They learned the composting and the rotation and the reading of the soil and the management of the channels and the subtle seasonal variations in the spring's flow that told you something about what the winter had been like and what the summer would require. When Clara could not be in the garden, Pearl was. When Pearl was occupied, one of the others was there. The knowledge passed from hand to hand the way Mrs. Dean had passed it, through demonstration and attention and the patient repetition of practice until the practice became instinct. Ezra Pruitt died on a September afternoon in 1915 on the porch he had built to face the bluff in the chair he had made from cedar, with the particular fitted joinery that was his signature, with a glass of blue spring water resting on the porch rail beside him. He had drunk that water every day for 29 years, and whatever the Vivianite had done to the faint blue tinting of his teeth, it had done nothing to the clarity of his mind, or the steadiness of his hands, or the quality of his attention to the things and people he cared about. He went the way the truly contented go without struggle in the late afternoon light, with the sound of the spring running beneath the porch in its continuous low voice, the same sound that had been the music underneath every day of the life they had built together. Clara buried him near the foot of the bluff, where the sound of the water never stops, that low and ceaseless voice of the mountain, giving up its gift patient and indifferent and utterly indifferent to the human grief that stood beside it. Though not indifferent, she had always felt to the human lives it had sustained. On the stone above him, she had the mason carve, the words that Ezra had written himself in the dirt of the garden path one evening, years before tracing them with one finger. For her to read the words that she had kept in the place where she kept the things that mattered most, knowing from the moment she read them in the dust that they were the truest words anyone had ever spoken about the spring, and the fear that had surrounded it, and the choice she had made when she was 16 years old and had nothing, and decided that having nothing was not a reason to accept nothing. This water was always good. We were only afraid of its color. Clara was not. She went on without him the way the spring goes on, because there is no other way forward available to the living. The garden did not stop. The channels did not stop. The Saturday teaching did not stop. The jars of blue water continued to leave the porch of the Crossroads store and find their way into the gardens of the Cove, and the harvests of Grassy Cove continued to be better than the harvests of the surrounding plateau in a way that visiting agricultural men from Nashville and Knoxville found notable, and that the families of the Cove found simply normal, because it had been normal for as long as most of them could remember. Pearl and her siblings organized the Cove families into a cooperative in the years after the war. Clara's sons, who had their father's gift for the practical working out of things, engineered a system of pipe that carried the blue water from the original pool outward through the valley, reaching farms that Clara had never walked, irrigating ground that had not known the mountain's gift in all the years it had been pouring itself into the basin at the foot of the bluff and running back into the limestone uncollected. The mountain's generosity, it turned out, had always been large enough to feed the whole cove. It had only ever required someone to build the channels. Old Hale's hives were still on the slope above the cove when Clara's grandchildren took over the cooperative. The blue honey those hives produced still carried that clean mineral note underneath the sweetness, the note that no one had ever been able to name precisely, but that everyone who tasted it reached for again. Some things resist naming and do not need it. They only need someone willing to taste them, first willing to trust the report of their own senses over the inherited certainty of people who never bothered to look closely at the thing they were warning others away from. Clara lived to see water she had once carried in a dented bucket flow through miles of pipe to fields she would never see with her own eyes. She lived to see the heirloom tomato seed that she had smuggled out of the Cumberland home in a tin can, the seed saved from Mrs. Dean's best vines, and selected each year for the largest and most flavorful fruit sold at market in Nashville and Knoxville under the name Blue Spring tomatoes, at prices that communicated without ambiguity how thoroughly the world had revised its assessment of the cursed lot and its cursed water. She died in the spring of 1927 in the garden as she had lived. Her hands were in the soil of the original bed where she had pressed Mrs. Dean's seedling into the ground 46 years before. Pearl said it looked as though she had been planting something, setting one more seed into the earth for whatever came next. Her youngest said it looked instead as though she had bent down to listen, pressing her ear toward the ground to hear the nation of small creatures that Mrs. Dean had first taught her were working in the dark beneath every good garden, turning death back into food in the way that all the best things do. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps planting and listening had always been the same act, and she had simply spent a lifetime learning that they were. The spring is flowing yet, blue and cold and carrying its freight of dissolved mountain up from the dark the way it carried it before. There was a county to fear it or a girl to drink from it. The cooperative that Pearl organized now feeds water to hundreds of acres across the cove. The tomatoes grown from seeds saved in an unbroken line since 1881 are known in 3 states. The stone above the foot of the bluff still holds the words, "A carpenter carved with a patient hand," and people who come to see the spring read them and stand for a while in the particular silence of someone encountering a truth they recognize but have not previously seen stated so plainly. So let me leave you with the question that the water asked Clara Mabin when she knelt beside it at 16 years old with $1 to her name and nowhere left to go. What blue spring are you walking past? What is the world holding out to you right now? Strange in color, wrong in appearance, surrounded by the voices of people who have never once knelt at its edge and tasted it, telling you with the full confidence of inherited fear that the water is bad. Mrs. Dean told Clara that fear and wisdom are hard to tell apart until you have done the one thing that separates them, which is to act on what you actually know rather than what you have been told to believe. A whole valley proved the cost of getting that wrong for 100 years, going hungry on thin soil within sight of the richest water in the county because no one would kneel down and find out for themselves. It took a girl with $1 and nothing left to lose to learn the difference between a thing that is dangerous and a thing that is merely unfamiliar. Sometimes the water that frightens you most is the sweetest you will ever taste. Sometimes the land that nobody wants has only been waiting patient as stone for someone desperate enough or brave enough or simply hungry enough to press a seed into the ground beside it and find out what the mountain has been keeping in the dark. Your dollar land is out there. Your blue spring is flowing yet. Stop listening to the ones who never wet their lips. Kneel down and drink.